Section 4.1, Chemical Energy and ATP. The chemical energy used for most cell processes is carried by ATP. ATP is said to be the energy currency for living things, the molecule that provides energy to do or carry out metabolic processes. All the carbon-based molecules in food store energy, chemical energy, in their bonds. So when bonds form, energy has been putting in to those bonds. And as we digest those, energy is released when we break them down. Carbohydrates and lipids are the most important energy sources in food you eat. Carbohydrates will be your first choice. Lipids carry the most amount of energy, but carbohydrates will be our first choice. However, this energy is only usable after these molecules are broken down by a series of chemical reactions. When molecules are broken down, the bonds that hold those molecules together are broken and energy is released. So energy comes from food, but not directly. ATP is the molecule that cells use for energy. All cells use chemical energy carried by ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. ATP is a molecule that transfers energy from food being broken down into cell processes, metabolic reactions that would be required by the cell. ATP carries chemical energy that cells can use to build molecules and move materials by active transport. So it's the molecule that's necessary to provide energy for metabolic reactions. Made up of an adenosine molecule, ribose sugar, and 3 phosphate groups. Energy is released when the bonds holding the second and third phosphate together are broken, releasing a bunch of energy, and this energy can be used for metabolic reactions. ATP gets turned into ADP and then back into ATP. This cycle here shows what's going on. When ATP, this is ATP, is broken down, this last phosphate group between second and third phosphate group, the bonds will get broken, releasing a phosphate out here, and it forms something called ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. This energy is released for the cell to use for whatever it needs to use it for, either for active transport or certain metabolic reactions that require energy or movement or whatever that cell needs to do. ATP is providing energy for it. This ADP molecule can be reformed into ATP by addition of a phosphate. This is the same phosphate that was released over here, and energy from food. So energy going in to make this molecule of ATP. So it's a cycle, ATP to ADP, back to ATP, continuous cycle. The energy carried by ATP is released, again, when this phosphate group is removed. The bonds being broken release the energy. When the phosphate is removed, ATP becomes ADP, adenosine phosphate, diphosphate, and it's converted back into ATP by addition of another phosphate and some energy to make this molecule form. Okay, this slide is showing the differences between ATP and ADP. Notice ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Tri means 3, so it has 3 phosphate groups attached by chemical bonds. Adenosine diphosphate has 2 phosphate groups, 2 meaning di, but everything else is the same. Adenosine, ribose sugar, phosphate groups. ATP transfers energy to cell processes. ADP is a lower energy molecule that can be converted back into ATP for that cycle to continue. Okay, organisms has to break down carbon-based molecules to make ATP. The foods that we eat don't have ATP that your cells can use. They have organic molecules that have to be digested. Okay, digested just means broken down into smaller components. When these things are broken down, depending on what type of food it is, what type of biological molecule it is, they'll give different amounts of ATP available to the cell. It's related to the number of calories that the food contains. It depends on the type of molecule that is broken down. So types of molecules that are broken down into ATP, the first choice for cells would be carbohydrates. They're most easily broken down. Okay, most commonly broken down to get ATP, but they don't produce the most amount of ATP. Lipids actually have the most available energy to break down, but it's just harder to get to. Okay, lipids don't really want to break down easily to break those bonds to release energy to produce ATP, so it's going to be a little harder to get to. Proteins have about the same amount of energy as carbohydrates, but they're not used as often. Proteins have so many different roles in the cell that they're not going to be broken down for food. They're going to be broken down from amino acids to produce the other proteins, enzymes that would be necessary for the cell to function properly. So as you can see here, carbohydrates get about 4 calories per milligram. 4 calories per milligram would give us 36 ATP. Okay, lipids, 9 calories per milligram would give 146 ATP, so much more ATP, but harder to get to. And then proteins, because they're so rarely used, there's 4 calories per milligram, but they really give no ATP because your cells just don't want to use that for a source. A few types of organisms don't need sunlight and photosynthesis as a source of energy. Okay, most organisms rely either directly or indirectly on sunlight and photosynthesis as their source of chemical energy. Plants would take in sunlight, CO2, and water to produce sugars through photosynthesis, and other organisms would either eat the plants or organisms would eat the organisms that eat the plants, and so they're getting energy either directly, plants, or indirectly, primary or secondary consumers, from sunlight. Some organisms don't get access to sunlight. They use chemical compounds that serve as an energy source. So the process that they go through is called chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. Remember, photo means light, so photosynthesis using light to make energy. These guys are using chemicals, so chemical energy to make food. Okay, a lot of these things lie on the bottom of the oceans near these hydrothermal vents. Okay, and the heat and energy, the hydrogen sulfides that are coming from these underwater volcanoes, for lack of a better word, black smokers, are going to provide the energy to make these carbon-based compounds, which would start out as the primary food source for this ecosystem that will be around this hydrothermal vent. So how are chemosynthetic and photosynthetic organisms similar as energy sources? Well, they both produce carbon-based molecules that would be the primary food source for their ecosystem. That are primary producers for their ecosystem. Now, photosynthetic organisms, can't speak and read at the same time. Ecosystem. There you go. Photosynthesis obviously uses light energy to do this. Chemosynthetic organisms use chemical energies to do this, but they both produce carbon-based molecules, sugars and other things, that are their primary producers or their primary food source for their respective ecosystems. ATP and ADP are related in that they form a cycle. Okay, when a phosphate is knocked off and energy is released, you form ADP from ATP. When ADP gets a phosphate added through energy being put in, ADP gets converted to ATP. So they're related in that they're part of this cycle of ATP to ADP back to ATP. The cell's going to recycle stuff as often as it can, doesn't waste. This is just one of those mini cycles. Okay, the types of molecules that are broken down to make ATP are carbohydrates. That would be the first choice. Okay, that'd be first. And lipids, which would be the second. Okay, carbohydrates being broken down most often is first choice, but they don't give the most energy. Give most energy. That would actually be from lipids. Okay, most energy produced. Just harder to do, harder to get to. Okay, and the proteins hardly ever, but they can be used in a pinch. How are some organisms able to survive without sunlight and photosynthesis? Well, because of where they are, they're going to rely on this process of chemosynthesis. Again, these would be around those black smokers on the bottom of the ocean, where they would take sulfide compounds, hydrogen sulfide, as an energy source to produce organic compounds, food sources for the ecosystem. So they don't need photosynthesis because they have chemosynthesis, an alternative method of getting food. Okay, how are the energy needs of plant cells and animal cells different, and how are they similar? So first, they're different in that plants are taking in CO2 and water with light energy to make food, right? To make food in the form of glucose, which then can get broken down in their mitochondria to produce ATP. Okay? Animals have to eat carbon-based compounds that were either plant-based, meaning made through photosynthesis, or animal-based, meaning they were made from an animal that ate a plant, and then we break down those organic compounds to get food. We're not making our own food as animals. Animals have to take in a food source and break it down to get energy. They're similar in that they both break down the same things, glucose being the first choice, or carbohydrates being their first choice. Plants make the carbohydrates to produce energy for their cellular needs, and animals will take in carbohydrates and break those down to get their energy needs taken care of.